The moment Ethan Caldwell pointed toward the security desk and said, "Remove her from the first-class line," he had no idea he was humiliating the woman who would soon have the entire airline leadership trembling in silence. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The massive terminal at Reagan National Airport glowed beneath cold white lighting as hundreds of travelers rushed across polished marble floors, dragging expensive luggage behind them. Boarding announcements echoed overhead, while businessmen in tailored suits filled the priority lounge entrance near Gate 14. Flight attendants moved quickly through the crowd with practiced smiles, and somewhere in the distance, the soft hum of jet engines vibrated through the glass walls overlooking the runway. In the middle of all that movement stood Vivian Brooks, quiet, composed, and almost invisible. At 39 years old, Vivian carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Her soft gray sweater hung loosely over black slacks, and her white sneakers looked worn from travel. A canvas tote bag rested on her shoulder beside a small carry-on suitcase that had clearly seen years of use. Nothing about her appearance suggested power, wealth, or influence, and that was exactly how she preferred it. Earlier that week, Vivian had spent 4 straight days visiting rural pediatric clinics funded by her Medical Technology Foundation. She had flown commercial her entire life despite having more money than most people in that airport could imagine. Private jets bored her. Attention exhausted her. Simplicity made her feel human. But across the terminal, Ethan Caldwell noticed her immediately for a very different reason. Ethan was the senior boarding supervisor for Crown Atlantic Airlines, a man who treated first class like a private kingdom. At 42, he wore his Navy uniform like military armor. His slicked-back blonde hair, polished shoes, and sharp jawline gave him the cold appearance of someone who measured human value within seconds. And in Ethan's world, appearance meant everything. The moment he saw Vivian quietly step into the first-class boarding lane, his eyes narrowed. He glanced at her tote bag, then at her sneakers, then at the boarding pass in her hand. Around them, several passengers dressed in designer coats and luxury watches exchanged subtle looks. One older man smirked while adjusting his Rolex. A younger woman whispered something under her breath and laughed quietly. Ethan stepped directly into Vivian's path before she could scan her ticket. "Ma'am," he said sharply, forcing a thin smile. "This line is reserved for first-class passengers only." Vivian blinked once, remaining calm. "I know," she answered softly, holding out her boarding pass. Ethan barely looked at it. Instead, his eyes drifted over her clothing again. "I think there may be some confusion," he said louder this time, enough for nearby travelers to hear. "Economy boarding starts 20 minutes from now." The crowd nearby began slowing down. Conversations faded. Even the gate agent behind the counter looked uncomfortable. Vivian kept her voice polite. "My seat is 2A." Ethan finally took the ticket from her hand. His expression changed for only half a second before the arrogance returned stronger than before. Then he looked up at her and said the words that would change everything. "People try to sneak into first class all the time," he said coldly. "But this airline has standards." For a few long seconds, nobody in the boarding area moved. The polished terminal lights reflected across the marble floor, while Ethan Caldwell held Vivian Brooks's boarding pass between 2 fingers as though it disgusted him. Nearby passengers exchanged quiet glances, their curiosity slowly turning into entertainment. Vivian stood perfectly still, one hand resting lightly on the handle of her carry-on suitcase, her expression calm despite the growing humiliation surrounding her. "There is no mistake," she said, evenly. "That ticket belongs to me." Ethan let out a faint laugh through his nose. "Ma'am, first-class passengers usually understand how this process works." The emphasis on the word usually carried enough venom to make several people nearby smirk openly. The older man with the Rolex folded his arms with amusement while the younger woman in a cream-colored designer coat shook her head as if she had seen this kind of thing before. Vivian kept her voice soft. "You scanned the ticket. You saw the seat assignment." Ethan tilted his head slightly. A printed boarding pass does not prove ownership. The comment drew another wave of whispers from the line behind her. Somewhere near the gate windows, a teenage boy lowered his headphones, suddenly interested in the confrontation unfolding. Vivian noticed all of it. The stares, the judgment, the way people instinctively sided with confidence over truth. But years of running billion-dollar negotiations had taught her something important. The loudest person in the room was rarely the most powerful. Behind the counter, a young gate agent named Melissa Harper shifted nervously. At 26, Melissa had only worked for Crown Atlantic Airlines for 8 months, but she already recognized the dangerous edge in Ethan's behavior. She had seen him embarrass passengers before, especially people he believed did not fit the image of luxury travel. Normally, she stayed quiet. Employees who challenged Ethan never lasted long at Gate 14. But something about Vivian unsettled her. The woman was too composed, too controlled. Most people being publicly accused would become angry or defensive. Vivian didn't either. "Sir," Melissa said carefully, her voice barely above a whisper. "The system already cleared the boarding code." Ethan shot her a sharp look without turning around fully. "I did not ask for assistance, Melissa." The young agent immediately lowered her eyes. Silence swallowed the counter again. Vivian glanced briefly toward Melissa, offering a small, grateful nod before returning her attention to Ethan. "If there is a concern," Vivian said politely, "you may verify my identification privately." Ethan's smile disappeared. "Privately," he repeated louder, making sure nearby travelers could hear every word. "Interesting choice." The crowd leaned in almost unconsciously. Even passengers walking through neighboring gates slowed their pace. Public humiliation had become the evening's entertainment. Ethan stepped closer to the counter terminal and crossed his arms. "You know," he said, "people attempting unauthorized upgrades often ask to avoid public verification." A soft murmur spread through the waiting area. The woman in the cream coat actually laughed this time. Vivian felt the sting of embarrassment crawl slowly up her neck, but her eyes never lost focus. "I am not attempting anything," she answered quietly. "I purchased that seat legally." Ethan tapped the boarding pass against the counter, then proving it should not be difficult. The overhead speaker announced final boarding for another flight nearby, but almost nobody at Gate 14 paid attention anymore. All eyes remained fixed on Vivian Brooks, standing alone beneath the cold white airport lights. Melissa swallowed hard behind the counter as Ethan's expression hardened further. Then, with deliberate cruelty, he raised his voice so the entire gate could hear him clearly. "Ma'am, if this is truly your ticket," he said, "then I need you to present a government-issued identification right here, in front of everyone." The atmosphere around Gate 14 shifted completely after Ethan Caldwell demanded Vivian Brooks present her identification in front of everyone. The tension that had started as quiet curiosity was turning into something uglier now. People were no longer simply watching. They were judging. Vivian could feel it in the lingering stares and half-hidden smiles spreading through the boarding area. She slowly reached into her canvas tote bag, while the terminal lights reflected across the polished floor beneath her feet. Her movements remained calm, controlled, almost graceful despite the humiliation surrounding her. Ethan watched her closely with crossed arms, his expression filled with smug certainty. In his mind, he had already decided exactly who Vivian was. A woman trying to slip into a world she did not belong in. Melissa Harper stood, frozen behind the counter, her fingers gripping the edge of the computer desk. She wanted to say something again, but fear kept her silent. Ethan had influence with upper management, and everyone at the airport knew it. Challenging him publicly could end a career before it even started. Vivian finally removed her wallet and handed over her identification without a word. Ethan took it slowly, almost theatrically, making sure the nearby passengers could see the exchange. The older man with the Rolex leaned sideways for a better view, while the woman in the cream coat whispered to another traveler beside her. "I guarantee this ends badly," the woman muttered under her breath. Ethan examined the identification card for several long seconds. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Vivian Brooks," he read aloud. "Interesting." Vivian remained still. "Is there a problem?" Ethan ignored the question entirely. Instead, he glanced down toward her tote bag, which had partially fallen open near the counter. Inside sat a thin silver laptop, a passport holder, and a dark blue leather folder with embossed lettering across the corner. Melissa noticed it immediately. So did Ethan. The folder carried the elegant silver logo of Whitmore Aviation Holdings, the private investment group that owned nearly 40% of Crown Atlantic Airlines. Ethan stared at it for a brief moment before his arrogance returned. "Cute prop," he said casually. A few people nearby chuckled quietly. Vivian calmly reached for the folder, but Ethan spoke again before she could respond. "You know," he said louder now, "people trying to impersonate executives usually overdo the accessories." More laughter rippled through the line. Melissa's stomach tightened. Something about the folder bothered her deeply. She had seen that logo before during internal corporate training videos shown to employees. Only senior partners and board-level affiliates carried those materials. But before she could process the thought further, Ethan slid Vivian's identification back across the counter. "This still does not explain the ticket purchase," he said coldly. Vivian looked directly at him. "I purchased the seat 3 weeks ago through your executive travel office." Ethan smirked immediately. "Executive travel office," he repeated loudly enough for several passengers to hear. "That is impressive." The sarcasm in his voice triggered another round of amused whispers. A businessman near the boarding lane shook his head with visible annoyance. "Can we move this along?" he muttered. "Some of us actually belong in first class." The words hung in the air like smoke. Vivian's cheeks warmed slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I have done nothing wrong." Ethan leaned closer across the counter. "Then perhaps you will not mind additional verification." Melissa's eyes widened. "Ethan," she whispered carefully. He raised one hand without even looking at her. "Not now." The terminal had grown strangely quiet again. Even nearby passengers sensed the confrontation crossing into dangerous territory. Ethan reached toward the phone beside the boarding scanner and slowly picked up the receiver while keeping his eyes locked on Vivian. Then, with a satisfied smile beginning to form across his face, he said the one thing that made the entire gate fall silent. "Security," he said clearly into the phone. "I need assistance with a passenger refusing compliance at gate 14. The silence after Ethan Caldwell called security felt heavier than the noise of the entire terminal combined. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. The only sounds came from rolling suitcases crossing distant marble floors and the muffled boarding announcements echoing through the airport ceiling. Vivian Brooks stood motionless beneath the bright gate lights while dozens of strangers stared at her as though she had become some kind of public spectacle. Ethan slowly placed the phone back onto the counter with the satisfaction of a man convinced he had already won. "Thank you for your cooperation," he said coldly, though there was no gratitude in his voice at all. Vivian looked at him quietly. "I have cooperated this entire time." Ethan ignored the response. "Unfortunately," he continued loudly, "Crown Atlantic Airlines reserves the right to deny boarding to any passenger involved in suspicious activity or disruptive conduct." The words hit the crowd, exactly the way he intended. Several passengers exchanged knowing looks while whispers spread through the gate area like a slow-moving wave. Suspicious activity. Disruptive conduct. Ethan had carefully chosen language that made Vivian sound dangerous without accusing her of anything directly. The older man with the Rolex gave a faint nod of approval. "About time," he muttered. The woman in the cream coat crossed her arms and sighed dramatically. "This is why flying has become unbearable," she complained to nobody in particular. Melissa Harper felt her stomach twist harder with every passing second. She knew what Ethan was doing. He was building a public narrative before security arrived, making sure everyone would automatically assume Vivian was the problem. Melissa glanced again toward the dark blue folder partially visible inside Vivian's tote bag. The silver Whitmore Aviation Holdings logo reflected under the terminal lights. Something about it continued bothering her deeply, but fear kept her silent. Vivian slowly reached down and adjusted the handle of her suitcase. Her face remained calm, though exhaustion had begun to settle behind her eyes. For days visiting children's hospitals across 3 states had already drained her physically. Now she stood in the middle of a crowded airport being treated like a criminal simply because she did not look wealthy enough to deserve respect. Ethan stepped aside from the boarding lane and gestured toward the waiting area near the windows. "You need to leave the priority boarding section immediately." Vivian looked at him steadily. "You are removing me from a seat I legally purchased." "I am protecting the standards of this airline," Ethan replied sharply. The crowd grew even quieter after that sentence. Even people who secretly agreed with him suddenly seemed uncomfortable hearing the arrogance spoken out loud so openly. Vivian lowered her eyes briefly, then looked back at Ethan with a calmness that somehow made him more irritated. "Standards mean very little," she said softly, "when dignity disappears." The words landed harder than shouting ever could have. A hush fell over Gate 14. For the first time since the confrontation began, Ethan seemed caught off guard. Not because Vivian had raised her voice, but because she had not. There was no anger in her expression, no desperation, no humiliation she allowed them to see. Only quiet disappointment. Melissa felt chills run down her arms. Nearby passengers shifted awkwardly. Some avoided eye contact entirely now. But Ethan quickly recovered, straightening his jacket with visible irritation. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "either step away from the gate voluntarily, or security will escort you." Vivian stared at him for another long second before finally nodding once. Without another word, she picked up her suitcase and slowly walked away from the boarding lane. The polished marble floor echoed softly beneath her white sneakers while dozens of strangers watched in silence. She stopped near the large terminal windows overlooking the runway, where rain had just begun streaking across the glass outside. Then, sitting alone beneath the cold airport lights, Vivian calmly reached into her tote bag and unlocked her phone. Vivian Brooks sat quietly beside the rain-streaked terminal windows while the lights from the runway shimmered across the wet glass outside. Behind her, the noise of Gate 14 slowly returned in cautious waves. Boarding announcements resumed. Suitcases rolled across marble floors. Conversations restarted in lowered voices. But every now and then, someone still glanced toward the woman who had just been publicly removed from the first-class line, without raising her voice once. Vivian rested her phone gently in her lap after sending a single message. No long explanation. No threats. Just 6 simple words. "Are you aware of Gate 14? Then she leaned back into the chair and closed her eyes briefly as exhaustion settled over her shoulders. The past week had taken more out of her than anyone in that terminal could possibly understand. For days earlier, she had stood inside a small pediatric clinic in rural Montana watching doctors struggle to treat children without enough medical equipment. Before that, she had visited another hospital in Oklahoma where outdated machines kept delaying emergency diagnoses for families who could barely afford treatment at all. Vivian had spent nearly 15 years building Brooks Medical Systems to solve exactly those kinds of problems. Every dollar she earned became another clinic funded, another machine delivered, another child helped. Wealth had never impressed her. Impact did. That was why tonight mattered more than anyone realized. Tomorrow morning in Boston, Vivian was scheduled to announce the largest nonprofit pediatric healthcare expansion in company history. 50 new mobile diagnostic units, hundreds of jobs, thousands of children receiving treatment in underserved communities. She had promised herself years ago that no child would suffer because adults decided dignity belonged only to the wealthy. The memory returned suddenly now as she stared through the rain-covered glass. Her father standing beside her in a crowded airport when she was 12 years old. Worn denim jacket, calloused hands, people judging him because he looked poor. She still remembered the humiliation in his eyes after an airline employee spoke down to him in front of strangers. Later that night, her father had told her something she never forgot. "The world will always tell you who matters," he had said quietly. "Your job is to prove them wrong without becoming cruel yourself." Vivian opened her eyes slowly. Across the gate area, Melissa Harper stood behind the counter pretending to organize paperwork while secretly watching her. Guilt was written all over the young woman's face. After several hesitant glances toward Ethan Caldwell, Melissa finally stepped away from the desk carrying a small cup of coffee. Her nervous footsteps echoed softly as she approached the waiting area. "Ma'am," she said quietly. Vivian looked up immediately. Melissa held out the coffee with trembling hands. "I know this probably does not help much," she said apologetically, "but I am really sorry for how you were treated." Vivian accepted the cup gently. "Thank you." Melissa lowered her voice further. "I should have said something sooner." Vivian offered her a small, tired smile. "Kindness delayed is still kindness." The words caught Melissa completely off guard. She blinked rapidly, clearly, fighting emotion. Most people in Vivian's position would have lashed out by now, demanded names. threatened lawsuits. But somehow the woman sitting alone beside the rain-covered windows was comforting her instead. Melissa glanced nervously back toward the gate counter where Ethan continued speaking confidently with several passengers. He thinks he is protecting the airline image, Melissa whispered carefully. Vivian stirred the coffee once before answering. People who confuse appearance with value usually end up revealing themselves. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the dark runway while planes taxied through sheets of rain. Then suddenly the atmosphere inside the terminal changed. Near the private elevator beside Gate 14, a sharp electronic chime echoed through the corridor. Melissa turned first. Several employees near the gate instantly straightened their posture. Ethan stopped mid-sentence. And from the far end of the terminal came the unmistakable sound of polished dress, shoes moving quickly across marble floors. The sound of polished shoes moving across marble floors cut through the terminal like a blade. Conversation stopped almost instantly. Even the rolling suitcases near neighboring gates seemed to fade into the background as a small group of executives emerged from the private elevator beside Gate 14. At the center walked Charles Whitmore. He was taller than most people expected from television interviews, his silver hair perfectly combed, his dark overcoat hanging sharply over a tailored navy suit. The quiet authority surrounding him changed the atmosphere before he even spoke. Employees straightened immediately. Flight attendants lowered their voices. Two airport supervisors hurried behind him with visible panic on their faces. Melissa Harper felt her breath catch. Ethan Caldwell froze beside the boarding scanner. Charles Whitmore almost never appeared at terminals personally. As chief executive officer of Crown Atlantic Airlines and managing partner of Whitmore Aviation Holdings, he operated in boardrooms, private meetings, and international summits. People at Ethan's level only saw him during annual corporate broadcasts. But now he was walking directly toward Gate 14 with an expression so cold it drained the color from Ethan's face almost immediately. The terminal had gone nearly silent by the time Charles stopped near the boarding counter. Rain tapped softly against the giant windows behind Vivian Brooks, while the white airport lights reflected across the marble floor between them. Ethan quickly forced a professional smile and stepped forward. "Mr. Whitmore," he began nervously, "we were just handling a situation involving a passenger." Charles raised one hand slightly without looking at him. The gesture alone shut Ethan up instantly. Charles's eyes moved past the counter toward the waiting area near the windows where Vivian still sat calmly, holding the untouched cup of coffee Melissa had brought her earlier. For one brief moment, the hard corporate expression on his face shifted into something else entirely. Concern. Respect. Then Charles Whitmore walked directly past Ethan Caldwell without acknowledging him further. Every employee near the gate watched in stunned silence as the most powerful man in the airline crossed the terminal floor himself instead of summoning anyone over. Vivian slowly stood as he approached. "Charles," she said quietly. The familiarity of his first name hit Ethan harder than any scream could have. Charles stopped directly in front of her. "Vivian," he replied, his voice low and controlled. "I came as soon as I received your message." The room seemed to lose oxygen. Melissa's eyes widened. The older passenger with the Rolex lowered his arms slowly. Even the woman in the cream coat looked suddenly uncertain now. Ethan stared in confusion as Charles glanced toward the dark blue folder inside Vivian's tote bag. "I should have warned them you were traveling tonight," Charles said carefully. Vivian shook her head once. "No, you should not have needed to." The sentence landed with quiet force. Charles exhaled slowly before turning for the first time toward the boarding counter. Ethan immediately straightened his posture, trying desperately to recover control of the situation. "Sir," he said quickly, "there appears to have been a misunderstanding regarding passenger verification procedures." "Verification?" Charles interrupted calmly. Ethan swallowed hard. Charles stepped closer now, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, Ethan Caldwell looked genuinely afraid. "Do you have any idea who you removed from that boarding line?" Charles asked quietly. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence around Gate 14 became suffocating. Several passengers subtly stepped backward. Melissa could actually hear the rain striking the terminal glass now. Charles looked toward Vivian again before speaking one final sentence that seemed to stop the entire airport in its tracks. "This woman," he said coldly, is the reason this airline still exists. No one at Gate 14 spoke after Charles Whitmore revealed who Vivian Brooks truly was to the airline. The silence spreading through the terminal felt almost unreal now, heavy with shock and embarrassment. Ethan Caldwell stood frozen beside the boarding scanner, his face drained completely of color as the reality of the situation slowly settled over him. The same passengers who had laughed only minutes earlier now avoided looking directly at Vivian at all. The older man with the Rolex lowered his eyes toward the marble floor. The woman in the cream-colored coat quietly stepped backward into the crowd, as if trying to disappear. Charles Whitmore turned toward Ethan fully now, his calm expression somehow more intimidating than anger. "Explain exactly what happened here," he said. Ethan swallowed hard before forcing his voice to work again. "Sir, I was only following passenger verification protocol." Melissa Harper looked down immediately after hearing that sentence. Her conscience had already been battling her for the past 20 minutes. But hearing Ethan twist the truth pushed her too far. Before fear could stop her again, she stepped out from behind the counter. "That is not true." The words echoed clearly across the silent gate. Ethan turned sharply toward her. "Melissa," he warned quietly. But she kept going anyway. Her hands trembled slightly, yet her voice grew steadier with every word. Her ticket cleared immediately. The system verified her seat assignment before any issue started. Several employees nearby exchanged nervous glances. Melissa inhaled shakily. She offered private identification verification more than once. Mr. Caldwell refused. Ethan's jaw tightened. "You do not understand the full situation." "I understand enough," Melissa answered softly. Charles Whitmore never took his eyes off Ethan. "Continue." Melissa looked briefly toward Vivian, who remained calm despite every eye in the terminal now focused on her. "He assumed she did not belong in first class because of how she looked," Melissa admitted quietly. "And once people started watching, it got worse." A painful silence followed. Ethan's confident posture finally began collapsing under the weight of public truth. He tried one final time to regain control. "Sir, with respect, appearances matter in premium travel environments." The sentence was a disaster the moment it left his mouth. Several nearby passengers visibly cringed. Charles Whitmore stared at him with disbelief. "Do you know why Vivian Brooks became involved with this airline?" Ethan said nothing. Charles gestured toward Vivian carefully. 3 years ago, when Crown Atlantic was weeks away from bankruptcy, most investors walked away. Fuel costs were exploding. Routes were collapsing. We were preparing layoffs across 6 states. The terminal remained completely still as he continued. Vivian Brooks invested nearly $600 million to keep this company alive. Gasps quietly spread through the crowd. Ethan blinked rapidly. Melissa covered her mouth in shock. Charles's voice lowered further. "Not for profit. Not for publicity." She demanded only one condition. He paused. That no employee lose their healthcare benefits during restructuring. The silence afterward felt electric. Vivian finally spoke for the first time since Charles arrived. "People were already struggling enough," she said quietly. "Families should not suffer because corporations panic." Melissa's eyes filled instantly. Nearby airline employees exchanged stunned looks as realization spread through them one by one. Some of them were standing there tonight with jobs, insurance, and stability because of the woman Ethan had publicly removed from the first-class line. Ethan looked physically ill now. "Ms. Brooks," he stammered weakly. "I did not know." Vivian interrupted him gently. "No," she said calmly. "You decided before you wanted to know." The sentence hit harder than any public humiliation ever could have. Charles Whitmore glanced toward security officers standing awkwardly near the gate entrance, unsure whether to approach anymore. Vivian noticed them too. "Please," she said softly, "do not turn this into cruelty." Charles looked at her carefully. "After what happened here," Vivian gave a small tired shake of her head. "Humiliation does not teach dignity." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then slowly, almost unbelievably, the atmosphere around Vivian Brooks transformed completely. The same strangers who had looked at her with suspicion now watched her with something entirely different. Respect. Rain continued sliding down the giant terminal windows while the atmosphere at Gate 14 transformed into something almost unrecognizable. 20 minutes earlier, Vivian Brooks had stood alone beneath the cold airport lights while strangers questioned whether she belonged in first class at all. Now the same people watched her with stunned silence and growing shame. Charles Whitmore remained beside her near the waiting area, while airline supervisors quietly gathered near the boarding counter, speaking in tense whispers. Ethan Caldwell still stood frozen beside the scanner, no longer looking like the confident gate supervisor who had controlled the room earlier. His shoulders had collapsed slightly now, and the arrogance in his face had been replaced by something far more human. Regret. Charles finally broke the silence. "Effective immediately," he said calmly. "Mr. Caldwell will be placed under formal review pending investigation into discriminatory passenger conduct." Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. There was no argument left in him anymore. No anger. No excuses. Only the crushing realization that his own words had destroyed the image he worked so hard to build. Charles continued speaking in the same measured tone. Crown Atlantic was rebuilt on the promise that people would be treated with dignity regardless of status, appearance, or income. He glanced briefly toward Vivian. Some of us seem to have forgotten that. Nearby employees stood perfectly still. Melissa Harper felt tears sting her eyes as several co-workers slowly looked at her with new respect. Charles turned toward her next. "Melissa," he said, "thank you for telling the truth when it mattered." Melissa looked completely caught off guard. "I was afraid to speak up," she admitted quietly. Vivian gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Courage is not the absence of fear," she said softly. "It is choosing decency despite it." The words settled deeply across the terminal. Even the passengers who had mocked Vivian earlier now looked visibly uncomfortable with themselves. The older man with the Rolex stepped forward awkwardly after several seconds. "Ma'am," he said quietly, unable to meet her eyes fully, "I owe you an apology." Vivian nodded politely without humiliating him further. One by one, the atmosphere shifted. Flight attendants approached with genuine kindness instead of rehearsed professionalism. Employees who had avoided eye contact earlier now greeted Vivian respectfully. The woman in the cream coat quietly picked up her designer handbag and walked away without another word. Charles Whitmore then looked toward the group of airline managers gathered near the gate. "Tomorrow morning," he announced, "all frontline staff training programs will be revised company-wide." Several supervisors straightened immediately. New customer service standards will include bias prevention and passenger dignity protocols. Ethan looked up slowly after hearing that. Charles's voice remained calm but firm. "No traveler should ever feel unwelcome because they do not fit someone else's idea of wealth." Vivian glanced around the terminal carefully before speaking again. "Do not make this policy about me," she said softly. "Make it about the people who never get defended." Charles nodded once in quiet understanding. Melissa looked at Vivian with admiration now. "Most people with your influence would have demanded punishment." Vivian looked toward the rain outside. "The windows. Humiliating people rarely changes them," she answered quietly. "Being forced to see themselves honestly sometimes does." Ethan heard every word, and somehow that hurt more than being yelled at ever could have. Security officers quietly stepped away from the gate entirely now, no longer needed. The tension that once filled the terminal had disappeared, replaced instead by a strange stillness filled with reflection. Boarding for the Boston flight resumed moments later, but this time something was different. As Vivian Brooks walked calmly back toward the first-class boarding lane with her carry-on suitcase beside her, passengers instinctively stepped aside for her without being asked. Not because of her money, not because of her power, but because every person standing there suddenly understood the kind of character they had witnessed. Ethan remained near the counter as she passed him. He opened his mouth slightly, struggling to find words. Vivian paused only briefly beside him. "The hardest thing about respect," she said gently, "is that you cannot recognize it if you only look for status." Ethan stared silently at the marble floor after she walked away, finally understanding the lesson far too late. The cabin lights inside the overnight Boston flight dimmed softly as rain continued washing across the runway outside. Vivian Brooks finally settled into seat 2A with quiet relief, resting her head briefly against the leather seat while the last passengers boarded. For the first time that evening, the noise around her no longer felt heavy. The humiliation, the whispers, the stares from strangers at Gate 14 already seemed distant now, fading behind the quiet rhythm of the aircraft preparing for departure. Across the aisle, several passengers who had witnessed the confrontation earlier now looked at Vivian differently. Not with curiosity, not with envy, but with genuine respect. A flight attendant approached, carefully holding a folded note in trembling hands. "Ms. Brooks," she said softly, "someone asked me to deliver this personally." Vivian accepted the paper and unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was uneven but sincere. "I judged you before I knew you. I am deeply ashamed of that. I hope someday I learn the kind of grace you showed tonight. Ethan Caldwell." Vivian stared at the note quietly for several seconds before folding it again with care. No anger crossed her face, only sadness for how easily people forgot the humanity in front of them. Moments later, Charles Whitmore himself stepped briefly into the aircraft cabin before departure. Several passengers straightened immediately when they recognized him. Charles approached Vivian's seat with a calmer expression now, though exhaustion still lingered behind his eyes. "Everything has been handled," he said quietly. Vivian looked up at him. "And Ethan?" Charles exhaled slowly before answering. He accepted the review decision without argument. Vivian nodded once. "Good." Charles studied her for a moment. Most people would have wanted him fired immediately. Vivian glanced toward the dark runway outside the window. "If humiliation solved arrogance," she said softly, "the world would already be kind." Charles gave the faintest smile after hearing that. Then his expression shifted slightly. "There is something else you should know." Vivian looked back toward him. "Melissa Harper has been promoted." Vivian blinked in surprise. Charles nodded. "Regional Passenger Relations Training Program. Effective next month." A soft warmth crossed Vivian's tired face for the first time all evening. "She earned it." Charles lowered his voice further. "She reminded people what integrity looks like." As he walked away, Melissa herself appeared near the front cabin entrance, holding back visible emotion. "Ms. Brooks?" she asked quietly. Vivian motioned for her to come closer. Melissa swallowed hard. "I just wanted to thank you," she said. "Tonight could have ruined everything for me too." Vivian shook her head gently. "No, tonight revealed who you already were." Melissa's eyes watered immediately. "I have never met anyone who stayed that calm after being treated so unfairly." Vivian smiled faintly. "My father taught me something a long time ago." Melissa listened carefully. "He said the world changes slowly." Vivian continued softly. "Usually one decent decision at a time." For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Melissa surprised herself by asking the question that had quietly haunted her since the terminal confrontation began. "Why do you still fly commercial?" Vivian looked around the cabin. Families settling into seats. Flight attendants helping elderly passengers with luggage. A little girl pressing her face against the window to watch the rain. Ordinary people carrying invisible burdens through ordinary lives. "Because this," Vivian answered gently, "is where humanity actually lives." Melissa smiled through tears before quietly stepping away. Minutes later, the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate while the runway lights stretched endlessly into the stormy night outside. Somewhere far behind them, Ethan Caldwell remained alone near the empty boarding counter at Gate 14, staring at the polished marble floors where his pride had collapsed hours earlier. And for the first time in many years, he understood that the most dangerous mistake a person can make is believing dignity belongs only to the powerful. And that night, everyone remembered that respect is not recognized by wealth, status, or appearance. It is recognized by the humility to see the humanity in someone before judging their worth.